The morning sun stretched long, golden fingers across the wreckage of Pearl Harbor, glinting off twisted metal and blackened slabs of concrete. I sat hunched over my desk, buried beneath towers of intercepted Japanese transmissions, the faint hum of decoding machines filling the air around me. It was late April of 1942, and I hadn't laid eyes on my family in what felt like forever. My uniform was a mess, wrinkled from too many nights spent in the same chair. My eyes burned red from lack of sleep, but my mind had never been sharper. Something was coming. I could sense it, hidden in the patterns of enemy chatter, in the sudden surge of radio traffic flooding through Station Hypo like a river ready to overflow its banks. Outside my cramped, windowless office in the basement of the 14th Naval District's administration building, the once mighty Pacific Fleet was only a shadow of what it had been. 4 of our battleships still lay sunk in the harbor's mud. Hundreds of planes were gone. More than 2,000 Americans had perished on that infamous December morning when the Japanese struck with terrifying precision and power, leaving our Pacific defenses in ruins. But I knew something they didn't. The Americans weren't finished. We were hurting, yes, but we were learning, adapting, and getting ready to hit back. "Sir, another intercept from the Japanese 4th Fleet," one of my codebreakers said, dropping a freshly decoded message onto my already cluttered desk. The young man looked exhausted, the kind of tired that seeps into your bones. "They're requesting more supplies for something called Operation MI. That name lit a spark in my weary brain. For weeks, my team and I had been piecing together fragments of a massive Japanese operation, something big enough to make Pearl Harbor look small by comparison. But where? When? The coded term AF kept showing up in their messages like a riddle we couldn't quite solve. If we could just figure out what AF meant, maybe we could turn this whole war around. Meanwhile, up at Fleet Headquarters, Admiral Owen Park stood by his window, watching the salvage crews struggle to raise the sunken ships from the harbor floor. The white-haired Texan had taken command at the lowest point in our history, when morale was shattered and the enemy seemed unstoppable. Behind him, Commander Caleb Morgan, his intelligence officer, cleared his throat. "Admiral, Commander Leo's team believes they've found a pattern in the Japanese communications," he said carefully. "They think the enemy is planning something major for early June, possibly their biggest move since the war began." Park turned from the window, his sharp blue eyes locking on Morgan. He wasn't like most senior commanders who brushed off code-breaking as guesswork. He understood that in modern warfare, information could be every bit as deadly as a torpedo. "How sure are they?" he asked, his voice calm but heavy with authority. "Every decision that man made carried the weight of thousands of lives. Leo is willing to stake his career on it, sir," Morgan answered without hesitation. "He believes the target's somewhere in the Central Pacific. His team's working non-stop to narrow it down." The Admiral nodded slowly, thoughtful. If Leo was right, this could be the break we'd been waiting for. The Japanese had been sweeping across the Pacific like a tidal wave, swallowing island after island, stretching their empire from their homeland all the way toward Australia. But every empire has its limits, and maybe, just maybe, they were about to find theirs. Down in our decoding center, my team worked like men possessed. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, sweat, and the clatter of typewriters. A room full of tired eyes and racing minds, chasing one dangerous secret. The basement reeked of stale coffee. Rows of clattering IBM tabulators never stopped, chewing through thousands of code groups while men and women in rumpled uniforms hunched over worksheets, hunting for patterns in what looked like random letters. "I've got something," said Lieutenant Commander Adrian Ham Klein, one of my Prado-Crypt analysts, and the whole table leaned in. The Japanese kept mentioning water desalination gear when they referred to AF. Why would a major naval base need special water supplies? The pieces started clicking in my head. A place that would suddenly need extra water, somewhere important enough to justify a huge operation. My mind ran down the map and landed on Midway. That tiny outpost that watched the approaches to Hawaii. It made a kind of ugly, terrifying sense. Lieutenant Commander Felix Warren piped up with a plan that was as simple as it was brilliant. What if Midway reports water trouble? If the Japanese pick it up in their coded traffic and mention water, then AF is Midway. Get me a secure line to Morgan, I ordered. Tell Midway to send an emergency message, plain language, that their distillation plant is down. Out on the carrier USS Enterprise, Admiral Marcus Baer. Doyle lay in sick bay, skin raw from a nasty case of dermatitis. The hard-charging leader who'd led the early carrier raids was so sick he couldn't even stand. His task force was about to head into what might be the war's most important fight, and he couldn't command it. "Mac, you look like hell," Admiral Daniel Mercer said when he came by to see him. The two men were different as could be. Doyle loud and instinctive, Mercer steady and measured, but they trusted each other without question. "I'm giving you my command, Dan," Doyle said, voice weak. "Take my boys and hit those bastards hard. They trust you, and so do I." Mercer nodded, grave and ready. He'd never led carriers in combat before, but he knew naval warfare and he knew how to listen to the facts on the table instead of fighting his gut. Those qualities were about to be tested in ways nobody could imagine. On Midway, Colonel Arthur Pike walked the flight line and looked at the ragtag bunch of aircraft he had. The island's air group was a mismatched lot. A few obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, which pilots already distrusted, some newer Wildcats, and several bombers pressed into service. Most of the pilots were green, straight from training and short on real combat time. "Colonel, are we really supposed to stop the Japanese Navy with these?" Major Colton Reyes asked, jerking his thumb at the row of buffaloes. The pilot's nickname for them wasn't flattering. "We'll stop them, or we'll die trying," Pike said, flat and bitter. "Every minute we buy gives the fleet a better shot at the carriers. That's our job. Stall them with everything we've got." Back at Pearl, the pieces were starting to line up and confirmation was coming in. The news shot through our center like a live wire. Our intercepts showed Japanese intelligence mentioning that AF was having water shortages. That nailed it. The target was Midway. With that piece in hand, Park summoned his senior commanders for an emergency briefing. "Gentlemen, we know where they're headed and roughly when," he told the room. "The Japanese are sending at least 4 carriers against Midway in early June. This is our chance to lay an ambush." Captain Gavin Archer, Doyle's old chief of staff who was now serving under Mercer, studied the reports and spoke up about carrier strength. One of the pilots' reports said the Japanese had at least 6 carriers ready. If they brought them all, we were in trouble. Park cut in, calm but sure. "Our intel shows their forces are splitting. 2 carriers are being sent toward the Aleutians as a diversion. That leaves 4 for Midway, and we'll have 3 to meet them." The numbers still looked grim on paper. The Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were battle-seasoned after Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids. Their pilots had years of combat behind them and were top-notch. Our carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, had brave crews, but far less hard-won experience. To make matters worse, Yorktown had taken heavy damage at the Battle of the Coral Sea and was limping back to Pearl. "How long to repair Yorktown?" Park asked the maintenance officer. 3 months minimum, Admiral," came the blunt answer. She'd taken deep bomb hits that tore into her structure and gutted her flight deck and fuel systems. Park looked at her, then said flatly, "You have 3 days. Whatever it takes, get that ship sailing with the others." The officer stared for a second, then saw the steel in his eyes. "Yes, sir. We'll work around the clock." By the end of May, Pearl Harbor was a frenzy. Some 1,400 men swarmed over Yorktown, welding, hammering, replacing systems, compressing months of work into 72 brutal hours. Men pushed until they collapsed, because every rivet and weld could be the difference between victory and defeat. On Yorktown, Lieutenant Commander Henty Thatch gathered his pilots and laid out new tactics aimed at countering the Zero's superior maneuverability. "Listen up," he said. "The Zero can outturn us, outclimb us, and it's faster. But it's lightly built. Our Wildcats can take hits and keep flying. We're going to fly a formation I call the Thatch Weave. Pair up, cover each other, and don't try to dogfight a Zero one-on-one." Among the pilots was Ensign George Gay, fresh out of flight school with barely 300 hours in the air. He tried not to let his nerves show while Thatch walked them through the plan. Torpedo bombers would have to fly in low and slow, easy marks for fighters and flak, and everybody knew those runs were near suicide. No one said the words out loud, but the fear hung in the room. Back in the intelligence offices, analysts kept working the puzzle, feeding every new intercept into the growing picture. The pieces were falling into place, but the cost of being wrong was unthinkable. They were putting together the full Japanese order of battle right before my eyes. Our intercepts made it clear that Admiral Kenji Okada, the man who'd masterminded Pearl Harbor, was personally directing this operation, and the strike force would be led by Admiral Daiichi Sato, the same commander who'd run the attack on Pearl. The picture the intelligence painted was one of brutal confidence. They weren't coming to probe. They were coming to finish what they'd started 6 months earlier. "They're bringing everything," one of Park's planners told the room. "Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports loaded with invasion troops." Their aim, our analysts concluded, was to seize Midway and turn it into a jumping-off base for operations against Hawaii. Park only shrugged, calm as ever. "Let them come," he said. "The bigger the force they commit, the more they stand to lose." On May 28th, Task Force 16, centered on Enterprise and Hornet under Admiral Mercer's command, slipped out of Pearl Harbor, screened by cruisers and destroyers with every crew at battle stations. 2 days later, on May 30th, Yorktown followed, her hull still bearing fresh welds and patches from the frantic repairs. The 3 carriers planned to meet northeast of Midway at a spot we called Point Luck, a perfect ambush position for the force the Japanese were steering toward the island. Aboard Enterprise, Mercer sat with his staff, studying the latest intercepts. He was quiet, deliberate, the exact opposite of the impulsive commanders some of us had seen, and he thought through every contingency before he acted. "The Japanese expect surprise," he told the officers. "They think our carriers are back at Pearl or still in the South Pacific. That arrogance is our edge. We have to use it." Commander Colin Rafferty, who led Enterprise's air group, went over the plan with his pilots. The man had seen enough to know the limits and strengths of both planes and men. "When we find their carriers, we hit them with everything," he said. "Dive bombers from high, torpedo planes low. Fighter cover will be thin, so speed and surprise matter." One of those pilots was Lieutenant Nicholas "Nick" Prado, skipper of Bombing Squadron 6, famous already for his precision in dive bombing, a skill that, we all hoped, would turn out to be decisive. Prado gathered his crews and drove home a single, hard rule. "We're searching for carriers, not battleships or cruisers. Don't get sidetracked, sink their carriers, and we win." As May bled into June, both fleets closed the gap and the trap tightened. Our code breaking had given us the position and the timing, but that advantage would count for nothing unless pilots flew well. Commanders chose wisely under pressure, and luck, the thinnest margin of all, held long enough for victory. On Midway itself, things were running hotter than ever. Every single aircraft we had was fueled up, loaded with weapons, and ready to go. Out on the beaches, the Marines were digging deep into that hard coral sand, carving out defensive positions wherever they could. Inside the radar huts, the operators kept their eyes glued to the screens, knowing that the first sign of the Japanese approach would show up there long before anyone could see it with their own eyes. We all knew the score. We were outnumbered. Badly. But that didn't matter much. We had our orders. Our job was simple. Hold the line long enough for the Navy to hit the enemy carriers. Commander Victor Simmerd, the senior officer on Midway, made one last round of inspections before nightfall. The place was packed to the brim. Ammunition stacked high, fuel drums everywhere, and planes crammed into every corner of the two little islands that made up the atoll. One well-aimed bomb could turn the whole base into a blazing inferno. But we didn't have the luxury of worrying about that. The fate of the operation depended on us holding out. As night settled over June 3, 1942, our PBY Catalina patrol planes took off from Midway, fanning out across the dark Pacific in long, sweeping search patterns. They were big, slow birds. Not much to look at, but they were our eyes out there. The men flying them knew full well that spotting the Japanese fleet would probably mean they wouldn't come back. Those lumbering patrol planes were easy pickings for the enemy's Zero fighters. Still, every crewman accepted the risk. Finding the enemy was worth dying for. Around 9 o'clock that morning, June 3rd, Ensign Leon Cross, piloting one of those Catalinas, caught sight of something on the horizon. "Sighted main body," he radioed in. "Bearing 262, distance 700 Gavin." The Japanese invasion force was found, but their carriers were still nowhere to be seen. That afternoon, 9 of our B-17s lifted off from Midway and went after the convoy. They dropped their bombs, but didn't score a single hit. Later that night, 4 Catalinas armed with torpedoes made a daring night attack, claiming they'd hit one ship. Even if they hadn't done much damage, it didn't matter. The Japanese now knew we were waiting for them. At 3 in the morning on June 4th, reveille sounded aboard our carriers. In the ready rooms, pilots listened to their final briefings and wrote what might be their last letters home. The mechanics gave the planes one last look, checking every bolt and wire. The ordnance crews worked in silence, loading bombs and torpedoes. 3 carriers, just 3, were about to face off against the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy with only about 230 aircraft between them. The odds were long, but we had one crucial edge. We knew they were coming, and roughly where to find them. Our commanders were ready to take risks. Smart, calculated ones. Admiral Martin Leon Hale, aboard the Yorktown and in overall command, made a bold choice. Instead of keeping all 3 carriers close for protection, he spread them out, making it harder for the enemy to catch them all in one blow. It was a gamble, sure. But then again, the whole battle was one big gamble. As dawn crept over the horizon on June 4, 1942, everything was in place for what would become one of the most decisive naval battles in history. The Japanese came on, full of confidence, believing they'd surprise us. Instead, they were sailing straight into a trap. The U.S. Navy, battered but unbroken after Pearl Harbor, was about to show the world that American grit and quick thinking could beat even the toughest odds. At 4:30 that morning, the quiet sky over Midway exploded with the sound of engines. Lieutenant Commander Ryo Tanaka led a wave of 108 Japanese planes from 4 carriers straight toward us. His force included 36 torpedo bombers loaded with general-purpose bombs for ground attack, 36 dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters as escorts. As they assembled in the dark sky, none of them had the slightest idea that our own carriers were waiting nearby. At 5:52, our radar screens lit up. "Many planes bearing 320 degrees, distance 93 Gavin," the operator called out, keeping his voice calm, though his pulse must have been hammering. Moments later, air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll. Marines scrambled to their battle stations, and pilots sprinted for their planes. Every aircraft that could fly had to get off the ground immediately, or be blown apart where it sat. Major Colton Reyes led his Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241 into the dawn, even with their outdated Buffalo fighters. Everyone knew they didn't stand much of a chance. The Buffalo was slow, clumsy, and outgunned by the Zero. But Reyes's men didn't hesitate. They were determined to defend Midway, no matter what it cost. "Would you like me to keep the we were told to defend our base no matter what?" Then came the shout over the radio. "Enemy fighters, 12 o'clock high." The static crackled with frantic voices as our Marine pilots climbed to meet the Japanese head-on. In seconds, the sky turned into a swirling nightmare. The Zeros came down on them fast and furious, cutting through the formation like hawks diving into a flock of pigeons. It didn't take long before the air above Midway was filled with smoke and fire. Flaming aircraft tumbled toward the ocean, trailing black plumes as they fell. Major Colton Reyes's plane was one of them. He went down, leading his men straight into the attack. But that sacrifice wasn't wasted. Their desperate charge threw the Japanese formation into chaos, forcing their bombers to break apart and take evasive action. And that disruption, just a few precious minutes, gave our own bombers time to clear Midway and head toward the enemy fleet, whose position had already been spotted by our PBY patrol planes. By 6:30 that morning, Commander Tanaka's strike group reached the island. Then all hell broke loose. Bombs thundered down on the airstrip, the fuel tanks, the gun emplacements, anything that could burn or blow up. Our anti-aircraft guns fired back without pause, filling the sky with bursts of black smoke. One bomb hit the power station, knocking out the radar. Another slammed into the fuel dump, setting off an inferno that sent thick columns of smoke spiraling into the morning sky. But as Tanaka circled above to assess the damage, he realized something the Japanese hadn't expected. The attack hadn't done its job. Sure, the runways were cratered, but they could be repaired. Most of our gun positions were still operational. And, most importantly, the planes the Japanese hoped to destroy on the ground were already in the air. Tanaka radioed back to Admiral Sato, reporting simply, "A second attack wave is required." That single message set in motion a series of choices that would decide the outcome of the Battle of Midway. Aboard the carrier Akagi, Admiral Sato found himself in a bind. He still had 93 aircraft waiting below deck, fully armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, weapons meant to sink ships, not blast airfields. Should he have them rearmed for another strike on Midway, or keep them ready in case American carriers appeared? At 7:15, Sato made his call, the one history would never forget. "Rearm for land attack," he ordered. Immediately, his crews went to work on the crowded hangar decks, removing the heavy torpedoes and replacing them with conventional bombs. It was dangerous, exhausting work. Live ordnance everywhere, aircraft wingtip to wingtip, and fumes from aviation fuel hanging thick in the air. One spark could have set the entire ship ablaze. What Sato didn't realize was that just 200 Gavin to the northeast, American carriers were already launching their own attack. Admiral Daniel Mercer, commanding the Enterprise and the Hornet, had made his move, an all-out strike launched at Noahimum range. It was a calculated risk. Most of the planes wouldn't have enough fuel to make it back, but it would catch the Japanese right when they were most vulnerable. "Pilots, man your planes!" The order echoed across the American decks as crews scrambled to their aircraft. Lieutenant Commander Henty Tate led Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, 15 lumbering Douglas Devastators that were brave, but outdated. He knew what they were up against. In his pre-flight briefing, Tate had been brutally honest with his men. "If we run out of fuel, we'll ditch together. If only one of us makes it through, he'll go for a carrier. May God be with us all." Among those pilots was Ensign George Gay, a young Texan, full of spirit, but not yet hardened by war. Before takeoff, he glanced back to check on his rear gunner, radio man Ben Holloway. Ben flashed him a thumbs up, trying to hide his nerves behind a grin. By 8 o'clock, the American strike was airborne, but scattered. Clouds broke up the formations, and each squadron had to fly on its own toward the estimated enemy position. That lack of coordination might have seemed like a disaster, but in the chaos to come, it would prove to be an unexpected advantage. Meanwhile, aboard the Japanese fleet, Sato's problems were piling up. At 7:28, a scout plane from the cruiser Tone finally broke radio silence with a report. 10 enemy surface ships bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 Gavin from Midway, course 150, speed 20 knots. But the pilot failed to mention what kind of ships they were. Were they destroyers, cruisers, or worse, carriers? That lack of detail threw everything into confusion. "Suspend rearming operations," Sato ordered, his voice tight with urgency. But down on the hangar decks, chaos ruled. Some planes were already reloaded with bombs, others were half converted, and munitions were lying everywhere. It was a dangerous, explosive mess, and the clock was ticking. At 7:28 that morning, the scout plane from the cruiser Tone finally broke through the radio silence. The message came in clipped and formal. 10 enemy surface ships bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 Gavin from Midway, course 150, speed 20 knots. But the report left out one crucial piece. What kind of ships were they? Without that detail, Admiral Sato couldn't tell if he was facing American carriers or just another surface fleet. That uncertainty paralyzed him. "Suspend rearming operations," he ordered sharply. Below decks, chaos erupted. Mechanics and ordnance crews scrambled in confusion. Some planes were fully rearmed for land attack, others were halfway converted, and munitions were scattered across the hangar floors. Fuel lines snaked through the mess as men shouted orders over the roar of engines. It was a dangerous, frantic scene, and it was eating up time they didn't have. That delay would turn out to be fatal. Then, at 8:20, another report came through from the same scout plane, one that froze the blood in Sato's veins. Enemy ships are accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. That was it. The Americans had carriers at sea, and Sato's own air groups were caught mid-change. Some planes loaded for land targets, others stripped of their torpedoes. To make matters worse, his first strike wave was returning from Midway, low on fuel and desperate to land. The Japanese fleet was caught in its most vulnerable moment, right in the middle of chaos. The first American counterattacks came in soon after, Marine dive bombers and Army B-17s flying from Midway itself. They came in waves, uncoordinated but determined. Their bombs missed, and the Japanese carriers dodged with ease, but every attack forced them to twist and turn, throwing flight operations into complete disarray. The Zero fighters tore through the American planes, leaving smoke and wreckage in their wake. Still, each failed strike kept the Japanese off balance, delaying their ability to recover or launch aircraft. Around 9:20, Lieutenant Commander Henty Tate finally broke through the clouds and spotted the Japanese fleet below. His torpedo squadron 8, 15 slow, outdated Douglas Devastators, was alone. The dive bombers and fighters were nowhere to be seen. Tate knew exactly what this meant. Attacking without fighter cover was suicide, but he also knew this might be their only shot. "Attack immediately," he ordered. The Devastators dropped low over the water, skimming the waves as they closed in on the enemy carriers. The Japanese Zeros swooped down from above like a storm of fire and steel. One by one, the American planes were cut apart. Explosions lit up the sky, and burning aircraft tumbled into the sea. Ensign George Gay watched it happen, helpless, horrified, as his squadron was wiped out around him. Tate's plane was hit and cartwheeled into the ocean, bursting apart on impact. Others exploded in midair or vanished into fireballs. Gay kept flying. His gunner, Ben Holloway, fired desperately at the attacking Zeros until a burst of cannon fire tore through the cockpit, killing him instantly. Gay pressed on, lined up his torpedo, and released it at the carrier Soryu. He flew so low over the ship that he could see the faces of Japanese sailors staring up at him. Seconds later, his plane was riddled with Barretts. It crashed into the sea and vanished beneath the waves. Somehow, George Gay survived. Wounded and shaken, he inflated his life Leonette and drifted beneath a floating seat cushion, watching the battle rage on around him, the only man left alive from his squadron. Torpedo Squadron 8 had been wiped out too, the last plane. All 15 Devastators were gone. 30 men had taken off that morning, only one returned. Their torpedoes had been plagued with problems. Most missed, and those that hit failed to explode. But their sacrifice wasn't meaningless. By forcing the Japanese fighters down to sea level, they'd left the skies above wide open. More American torpedo squadrons soon arrived, and they met the same grim fate. Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6 lost 10 of 14 planes. Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 lost 10 out of 12. Those old devastators and their unreliable torpedoes only seemed to confirm what the Japanese already believed, that they ruled the skies. But those repeated attacks, brave as they were, had a hidden effect. Every wave forced the Japanese carriers to swerve and turn, to dodge torpedoes and bombs. That constant maneuvering kept them from recovering aircraft or launching new ones. By 10:20, chaos reigned aboard the Japanese fleet. Their flight decks were jammed with returning planes from the Midway strike, all dangerously low on fuel and circling overhead. The hangars below were crammed with half-rearmed aircraft, bombs, and fuel lines. Everything was in motion, and everything was one spark away from disaster. Below deck, the Japanese carriers were a disaster waiting to happen. Planes were being refueled and rearmed as fast as the crews could manage. Bombs and torpedoes lay scattered across the hangar floors. Safety procedures were long forgotten in the rush to get another strike ready against the American carriers. It was chaos, and it was about to cost them everything. At that exact moment of no Ohimum vulnerability, Commander Colin Rafferty appeared overhead with 33 dive bombers from the Enterprise. He and his men had been searching for hours, pushing their fuel limits well beyond the point of safe return. Just as Rafferty was about to give up and turn back, he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer speeding northeast. He took a gamble, reasoning that the ship was racing to rejoin the main fleet, and followed its course. At 10:22 a.m., his persistence paid off. Through gaps in the clouds, Rafferty saw them. The Japanese carriers spread out below, their decks jammed with planes being fueled and armed. It was the perfect target and the perfect moment. No Zeros rose to challenge him. They were all still down low, finishing off the last of the torpedo bombers. Rafferty split his formation, assigning each squadron a target, then gave the order every American had been waiting to hear since Pearl Harbor. Attack immediately. Lieutenant Nick Prado led his section toward the Akagi, Admiral Sato's flagship. He rolled his plane over into a dive, the target growing larger with every passing second. At 2,500 feet, he released his 1,000-pound bomb and pulled up hard, skimming away through tracer fire. Most of the other bombs missed, the pilots were exhausted, and diving through walls of anti-aircraft fire. But Prado's hit was perfect. His bomb tore straight through Akagi's flight deck and detonated in the hangar below, right among the fueled and armed aircraft. The explosion that followed was apocalyptic. Fireballs ripped through the ship as aviation fuel and torpedoes went off in a chain reaction. In minutes, Akagi was a floating inferno. At the same time, Kaga was struck by at least 4 bombs from Rafferty's other squadron. Those hits set off uncontrollable fires among the tightly packed planes. And nearly simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Noah Drake's dive bombers from the Yorktown scored 3 direct hits on Soryu in what could only be called a textbook attack. It all happened in 6 breathtaking minutes. 3 of Japan's mighty carriers, ships that had bombed Pearl Harbor, were reduced to burning wrecks. From where he floated in the ocean, Ensign George Gay could see it all unfold. The massive carriers that had looked so invincible just moments before were now funeral pyres, black smoke curling into the sky. He watched Japanese sailors leap into the oil-slicked water to escape the flames. The bodies of his fallen squadron mates drifted nearby. Their sacrifice had made this moment possible. Aboard the Japanese fleet, chaos reigned. Admiral Sato, stunned and grim, was forced to abandon his burning flagship and transfer his command to a cruiser. In less than 10 minutes, 3/4 of his striking power had been wiped out. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were finished. Only Hiryu remained, racing northwest in a desperate attempt to strike back. For 6 months, the Japanese Navy had seemed untouchable, their aura of invincibility unbroken. But now, in a single morning, that illusion was gone. Still, the battle wasn't over. Hiryu's counterstrike came early that afternoon. Her dive bombers found the Yorktown, and despite fierce resistance from fighters and anti-aircraft guns, 3 bombs struck home. The carrier shuddered under the hits, fires breaking out across her deck. Damage control teams fought heroically to keep her afloat, and for a while, it looked like they might succeed. Then came the second wave. Japanese torpedo bombers diving low over the waves. 2 torpedoes slammed into Yorktown's side, tearing open her hull. Admiral Hale transferred his flag to a nearby cruiser, handing command over to Admiral Mercer. The crew had no choice but to abandon ship. Yet the Yorktown refused to die. She stayed afloat for days, battered but proud, until June 7th, when the Japanese submarine I-168 found her and put 2 more torpedoes into her hull. Only then did she finally slip beneath the waves. Her loss was painful, but by that time, Hiryu had already joined her sister ships on the ocean floor. Late in the afternoon of June 4th, dive bombers from the Enterprise found the last Japanese carrier. Their bombs set her ablaze from bow to stern, leaving her burning through the night. By sunset, the outcome was undeniable. 4 Japanese carriers, the same ones that had struck Pearl Harbor, now rested at the bottom of the Pacific. As the night settled in on June 4th, I watched our American pilots limp back to their carriers, running on nothing but fumes. Some planes, torn up from battle or out of fuel entirely, didn't make it back. They went down into the dark, restless sea. Our destroyers dashed through the waves, pulling pilots out of the cold water whenever they could. The cost in lives had been brutal, but the victory itself was undeniable. Admiral Mercer, steady, sharp, and deliberate, resisted the urge to chase down the retreating Japanese fleet. He knew Okada's battleships were lurking somewhere out there in the darkness, and our boys were bone-tired. It was smarter, he decided, to hold on to the win rather than gamble it all in a night fight where Japanese guns could tear us apart. People argued about that call later, but he was right. When dawn broke on June 5th, our search planes found only burning wrecks and a few scattered survivors where the enemy fleet had once stood strong. The last Japanese aircraft, launched desperately from damaged cruisers and dying carriers, made one final, hopeless attempt to strike back, but it came to nothing. Over the next couple of days, our forces stayed on them, hammering the retreating fleet, sinking the heavy cruiser Mikuma and damaging several other ships. The numbers that came in afterward were staggering. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, a heavy cruiser, 248 planes, and over 3,500 men, including many of their most seasoned pilots. We paid a price too. 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 147 planes, and 362 men. But those numbers didn't tell the whole story. Japan's offensive power in the Pacific had been shattered for good. From that moment on, the momentum was ours. In the aftermath, both sides tried to make sense of what had happened. For us Americans, the victory was proof that careful planning and solid intelligence could change the tide of war. Park's faith in his codebreakers, Mercer's cautious but smart tactics, and the sheer guts of our pilots all came together to pull off what most had thought impossible. For the Japanese, Midway was a harsh wake-up call. Their confidence, their complicated battle plan that split their forces, their failure to properly scout for our carriers, and those fatal minutes spent rearming aircraft, all of it came crashing down on them. But maybe the biggest reason for their downfall was the courage of our torpedo bomber crews. Their attacks looked hopeless at first, but they disrupted the Japanese just enough to open the door for victory. Men like Henty Tate and his squadron knew they were flying straight toward death, yet they didn't flinch. When word of our victory spread, America erupted. After 6 long months of defeats and retreats, we finally had a major win against Japan. We all knew the road ahead to Tokyo would be long and bloody, but Midway proved it could be done. The Japanese Navy, which had seemed untouchable since Pearl Harbor, had been brought to its knees by a smaller American force. Back in Japan, the government kept the truth buried. Sailors who made it home were kept isolated so the real story wouldn't leak. Officially, Tokyo claimed a grand victory, but deep down, the Japanese Navy knew what had happened. Their offensive push was finished. From then on, they'd be on the defensive, trying to hang on to what they'd taken while we grew stronger every day. Midway wasn't just a turning point in the Pacific, it changed world history. It showed how smart intelligence work could beat overwhelming odds, and how courage, even when it looked like failure, could turn the tide. Most of all, it proved that America had the heart and the power to take down even the toughest enemy. Admiral Parks said it proud in his after-action report. He gave full credit to the codebreakers who cracked the Japanese plan, to the commanders who kept their cool under pressure, and to the pilots who pressed their attacks against impossible odds. But he also admitted that luck played its part. If our dive bombers had arrived just 5 minutes later, after the Japanese had already launched their strikes, the outcome could have been completely different. Japan's Navy would never recover. The 4 carriers they lost represented years of shipbuilding and decades of pilot training, things that couldn't be replaced. Sure, they built new carriers later, but they never again had that same deadly mix of ships, aircraft, and skilled crews that had made their early victories possible. For those of us who lived through it, Midway was the defining moment of the war. Guys like Nick Prado, who dropped the bomb that doomed the Akagi, kept flying through the rest of the conflict, but nothing ever matched the intensity of those few minutes over the Japanese fleet. Others, like Ensign Gay, carried the memory of their fallen brothers for the rest of their lives. Midway also changed how wars at sea would be fought forever. For the first time, a major naval battle had been decided entirely by aircraft. Fleets never even laid eyes on each other. The era of the battleship was over. From that point on, the aircraft carrier ruled the seas. World War II had its turning points, and for us Americans, Midway was our Stalingrad, the moment when what looked like an unstoppable enemy finally hit a wall and then started getting pushed back. Alongside the brutal campaign that followed at Guadalcanal, Midway marked the beginning of Japan's long, painful retreat across the Pacific. Once America's industrial power kicked into full gear, the outcome was inevitable. Our factories began turning out ships and planes faster than Japan could ever dream of matching. The men who fought at Midway didn't stop there. They went on to fight in the Solomon Islands, the Philippines, and eventually all the way to Japan's doorstep. They'd learned something vital at Midway. The Japanese could be beaten. When our training, discipline, and equipment were put to proper use, we could match, and even surpass, the enemy's fierce determination and skill. For Japan, Midway laid bare the fatal flaw in their war plan. They had started a fight with a nation that had 10 times their industrial power, betting that spiritual strength and sheer will would make up for what they lacked in resources. Midway proved them wrong. We showed that America had not just the materials to fight, but the heart and grit to use them when it mattered most. The codebreakers who made that victory possible never got the spotlight they deserved at the time. Their work was locked away in secrecy for decades. Men like Carver Leo and his small team had pulled off what might have been the greatest intelligence breakthrough in U.S. history. They cracked the mystery of AF, pinpointed Japan's next move, and handed Park the exact information he needed to set the perfect trap. Even so, Leo's reward was bitter. Despite his vital contribution, Washington politics caught up with him, and he was quietly reassigned soon after Midway. His team's success had proven that information could win battles, but internal rivalries and red tape kept him from being recognized. It wasn't until 1986, long after his death, that he was finally honored with the Navy Distinguished Service Medal. As the years went by, Midway became almost legendary. A story told and retold in classrooms, strategy sessions, and war colleges across the world. It became the shining example of how sharp intelligence, bold leadership, and sheer bravery could combine to flip the odds against a stronger enemy. Military minds everywhere studied the battle, trying to understand how the Americans had managed to turn disaster into triumph. But beneath all the strategy and numbers, there was something deeper. The human side. Midway wasn't just about admirals and tactics. It was about ordinary men doing extraordinary things. The Marine pilots who took off in outdated planes and faced Japanese Zeros head-on. the torpedo crews who charged into battle without any fighter cover, the dive bomber pilots who kept searching for the enemy long after they should have turned back, the ship crews who fought fires and patched holes to keep their vessels afloat. Every single one of them helped secure that victory. The Battle of Midway proved something far greater than a tactical win. It showed that a democracy could stand toe-to-toe with a totalitarian power and prevail. Our carriers were manned by citizen sailors, men who, just months earlier, might have been farmers, mechanics, or students. They were up against seasoned warriors with years of combat experience and a deep tradition of victory. And yet, when the moment came, those American boys rose to the occasion with a courage and professionalism that still make me proud to this day. The lessons of Midway reach far beyond that one battle. It reminds us that what looks like weakness can turn into strength when paired with determination and clear thinking. That sacrifice, even when it seems to achieve nothing in the moment, can open the door for others to win. That technology means little without the will to use it, and that when free people are threatened, they can rise together to face any challenge, no matter how daunting the odds. When the sun went down on June 4, 1942, the course of the Pacific War had changed for good. Japan would fight on with its usual ferocity for another 3 years, but deep down, the balance had already shifted. The tide had turned, and this time, it was turning our way. By the time it was over, there was no longer any doubt. At Midway, a smaller, outnumbered American force had struck straight at the heart of Japan's naval power and turned the entire war around. Admiral Okada's grim pre-war warning had come true. He once said he could run wild for 6 months, maybe a year, but after that, he couldn't promise victory. Midway came exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. The man who had engineered Japan's early triumphs understood the truth before most others did. Once America had time to recover and unleash its full strength, Japan's defeat was only a matter of time. At Midway, that inevitability became real, spelled out in the flaming wrecks of 4 Japanese carriers and the sacrifice of countless brave men who fought and died under the vast Pacific sky. The impact of that battle went far beyond one day's victory. Midway showed the world that the United States could gather intelligence, plan a complex operation, and carry it out with precision and coordination that rivaled anything seen before. Our codebreakers, our strategists, and our pilots had worked together like a single machine, and in doing so, they forged a new kind of modern warfare. From that point on, every future operation would build on what we'd learned there, how to blend intelligence, timing, and firepower into one seamless effort. For those of us who lived it, Midway was more than strategy. It was a test of courage and endurance. Young men, many of whom had never faced combat, found themselves performing incredible acts of bravery. Mechanics stayed awake for days, keeping our planes patched up and flying. Damage control crews battled fires and flooding, saving ships that by all rights should have gone under. Radio operators kept lines open under heavy fire so our fleets could coordinate. Every man, no matter how small his role might have seemed, carried part of the weight of that victory. And I'll tell you this, the Japanese fought with courage too. Even as their carriers burned and their fate became clear, they fought with unshakable resolve. Many of their pilots chose to go down with their ships rather than surrender. Others, with planes too damaged to return, plunged straight into the sea. They fought with the same warrior spirit that had made them such fearsome opponents from the very start. Their courage, even in defeat, earned our respect. Both sides walked away with lessons that would shape the rest of the war. We Americans learned to refine our carrier tactics, to make better planes, and to finally fix our torpedoes. The Japanese tried desperately to rebuild, but they could never replace the carriers, planes, and veteran pilots lost at Midway. The momentum had shifted, and there was no turning it back. Our factories soon filled the Pacific with new ships and aircraft, while Japan's resources began to dry up. Looking back, Midway stands as one of the most decisive battles in naval history. In just a few minutes on June 4, 1942, The entire course of the Pacific War changed. Our dive bombers showed up at exactly the right moment, catching the Japanese carriers wide open. And in those fiery minutes, Japan's offensive power came to an end. From that day on, America began its long, steady push across the Pacific. Today, Midway Atoll is quiet. Its runways are cracked and empty, its old buildings falling apart. The place has become a wildlife refuge now, but to those of us who know its story, those waters are sacred. It was there that brave men from both nations gave their lives in a battle that shaped the world we live in. Their sacrifice reminds us that if Crossum always comes with a price, that careful preparation and sharp intelligence can overcome odds that seem impossible, and that ordinary people, when called upon, can do truly extraordinary things for their country. The legacy of Midway still lives on in the U.S. Navy. Our focus on intelligence, carrier aviation, and flexible tactics all trace back to that battle. It proved that modern war isn't just about who has the biggest guns. It's about who has the proto information and the ability to adapt faster than the enemy. It was the moment the world learned that aircraft could sink the mightiest ships, and that the side which thought quicker and moved smarter would win. Those lessons still guide naval strategy even today, in the 21st century. When we remember Midway, we don't just honor the victory. We honor the men who made it happen. From Admiral Park, calmly directing the fight from Pearl Harbor, to Ensign George Gay, floating alone in the ocean watching the result of his squadron's sacrifice, every one of them played a part. Together, their courage turned what could have been defeat into a defining victory, one that reshaped history and proved that a free people, united in purpose, can overcome any challenge placed before them. Midway was more than just a battle. It was a triumph of intelligence over ignorance, of preparation over complacency, and of courage over fear. It showed the world that America not only had the strength to fight a global war, but the will to see it through to the end. And more than anything else, it proved that the values we stand for, Crossum, democracy, and the resolve to defend them, can and will prevail against tyranny and aggression. That lesson, written in the waves around a small atoll in the middle of the Pacific, is as true today as it was on that unforgettable morning in June 1942.